It was a brisk evening in 1924, the streets of Harlem alive with a hum of excitement. But underneath that, there was a quiet tension, like the calm before the storm. The heavy footfalls of Bumpy Johnson echoed against the wet pavement, his presence commanding, the weight of his past trailing him like a shadow. No one in the area dared forget his reputation. The man who had risen from the gutters of poverty to take command of one of Harlem's most formidable criminal empires. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about his empire. He was thinking about something else, something bigger. Across the street, a new player had arrived in town, a man named Vincent Vinnie D'Angelo, with eyes too hungry for his own good and a reputation that had caught Bumpy's attention for all the wrong reasons. D'Angelo was ambitious, and in Harlem, ambition was a dangerous thing if you didn't know who you were dealing with. And tonight, as Bumpy walked towards the small speakeasy where D'Angelo had set up shop, the tension in the air thickened. A black car pulled up beside the curb, its engine rumbling like thunder in the distance. Out stepped Vinnie D'Angelo, a man who thought his new business venture in Harlem would go unnoticed by the city's most influential criminal. But Bumpy saw through the arrogance in his walk, the glint of bravado in his eyes. He wasn't a man who would play second fiddle to anyone. The night had just begun to take shape, but the pieces were already in motion. The streets of Harlem knew one thing for sure. If Bumpy Johnson wanted something, he'd take it. The legend of the street was about to clash with the ambition of a newcomer. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, nor did he come to power by sheer luck. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, his early life was one of hardship, the kind that shaped a man into something more than human. Growing up in a neighborhood steeped in poverty, Bumpy quickly learned the value of power and respect. It was a place where survival was a matter of knowing the right people, and Bumpy made it his business to be the one people went to when they needed something done. Harlem in the 1920s was a battleground. On one side, the Irish and Italian mobs, powerful but limited in their reach. On the other, the black community, struggling for respect in a world that saw them as lesser. Bumpy had seen both sides of this fight, but he had something neither could ignore: the streets themselves. The clubhouses, the back alleys, the speakeasies, all were Bumpy's domain. The people loved him because he fought for their survival. He made sure the drug trade was smooth, that the politicians in his pockets stayed loyal, and that the community felt his influence in every aspect of Harlem life. He wasn't just a man. He was a force, a name that even the biggest of players knew to fear. By 1924, Bumpy Johnson had earned the title of the King of Harlem, not just for his control over the streets, but for his uncanny ability to manipulate every situation in his favor. If you crossed him, there was always a price, and tonight it seemed someone was about to pay that price. But the real question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? Vincent D'Angelo wasn't from Harlem, but he had a reputation that had made its way through the city like wildfire. He was a smooth talker, a hustler with a certain charm that drew people in. But for all his charm, D'Angelo didn't understand the first thing about Harlem. He didn't know the codes that govern these streets, or the respect that was demanded from the likes of Bumpy Johnson. When D'Angelo opened up his speakeasy on 125th Street, it wasn't just a bar. It was a declaration, a challenge. He had big ideas about cornering the liquor trade in Harlem, something Bumpy had mastered years ago. The newcomers always thought they could outsmart the old-timers, but they didn't know that in Harlem, you had to earn your place.
D'Angelo's mistake was thinking he could buy it.
The first encounter between the two men wasn't some grand showdown. It wasn't a public spectacle, no, it was quieter than that, subtle, like a predator closing in on its prey. Bumpy had walked into the speakeasy, his presence alone shifting the atmosphere in the room. Conversations stopped, eyes turned. The bartender froze as Bumpy approached, his shoes clicking against the floor. He didn't look at D'Angelo right away. He didn't need to. The silence in the room spoke volumes. D'Angelo, on the other hand, felt the weight of the moment. He had heard about Bumpy, of course, but there was something different about facing him in person. There was a fear that bubbled up inside him, a fear he tried to swallow down with bravado. "Mr. Johnson," D'Angelo said, his voice trying to mask his nerves. "I've heard a lot about you." Bumpy's eyes never left him. "Yeah, I'm sure you have." There was a beat of silence. D'Angelo was trying to size him up, but Bumpy was already 3 steps ahead, watching, calculating. He could see D'Angelo's eyes darting around the room, looking for his exit strategy, his way out. "You're new here, Vinnie, and this is my town," Bumpy finally said, the words like a cold wind blowing through the room. D'Angelo straightened, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just here to make a living, Mr. Johnson. No disrespect." But Bumpy wasn't interested in words. He had heard enough of them over the years. What he wanted was action. Respect was earned through actions, not speeches. And as the two men stared each other down, the tension was palpable, like 2 bulls ready to charge at each other. "Would you like me to continue to part 2? "Continue." The room was suffocating with the weight of unspoken words. Bumpy stood there, his broad shoulders relaxed, but taut with menace, a storm that could break at any moment. His gaze was unflinching as he locked eyes with D'Angelo, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of his stare. Bumpy had seen men crumble before him, some from fear, others from sheer respect. But D'Angelo was different. He wasn't going to back down without a fight. D'Angelo adjusted his jacket and cleared his throat, trying to summon the courage that had carried him this far. "I didn't come here to start trouble, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice strained but firm. "I just want to do business. Your way or mine, it doesn't matter to me." Bumpy's lips curled into a half-smile. It was the kind of smile that made the air thick with tension. "You don't get it, do you, Vinnie?" he said softly, his voice steady and lethal. "This ain't about business. This is about respect. You come into my town, try to play my game, without even asking who's in charge. And now you're standing here, acting like it's just another deal. Like we're equals." D'Angelo bristled, his pride flaring. "I don't need anyone's permission to run my business. I'm not here to kiss anyone's ring. Not yours, not anyone else's." The words hung in the air like poison. Every person in the speakeasy was watching now, some with quiet anticipation, others with growing unease. Bumpy's reputation was built on more than just muscle. It was built on wisdom, on knowing how to move through life with purpose and power. He didn't need to scream or shout. His very presence commanded attention. "You don't have to kiss my ring, Vinnie," Bumpy said, his voice now cold, almost distant. "But you'll learn who's in charge here, one way or another." He stepped closer, his steps slow and deliberate, the sound of his shoes against the wood floor echoing in the tense silence. The eyes of every person in the room were on them now. The moment stretched so thin that it seemed as if time itself had slowed. D'Angelo's bravado began to falter. He knew how the game was played, but he hadn't prepared himself for Bumpy Johnson's brand of authority. Bumpy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black cigarette case. With a practiced hand, he lit a cigarette, the flick of the match sending a sharp, bright flare of light across his face. He inhaled deeply, exhaling the smoke in a slow, controlled stream. "I built this empire. I didn't just walk in and hope for the best. I fought for it. And you think you can just waltz in and take a piece without paying the price?" D'Angelo clenched his fists. "I'm not intimidated by you, Bumpy. If you want to fight, I'm not backing down." Bumpy's smile didn't falter. "You won't back down, huh? That's the problem with men like you. You think you can fight your way out of everything, but you don't understand. There are things money can't buy. Respect is one of them, and I'm the one who decides if you get it." The tension in the room reached its peak. D'Angelo's fingers twitched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might make a move. But Bumpy had already anticipated it. He was faster, sharper, an instinct honed by years of survival on these unforgiving streets. In a flash, Bumpy was in front of him, gripping D'Angelo by the collar, lifting him off the ground with surprising ease. The movement was so swift, so precise, that the air in the room seemed to freeze. The silence was deafening. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one dared to even breathe. "Let me make one thing clear, Vinnie," Bumpy growled, his face inches from D'Angelo's. "I don't need to fight you. I don't need to prove anything to you. What I'm offering you right now is a chance to walk away. I'm not going to embarrass you, but you don't get to walk in here and disrespect me. Not in my town." D'Angelo's eyes widened with fear, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was nod, his chest heaving as Bumpy held him in place. Bumpy released him suddenly, sending D'Angelo stumbling back. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the room, but Bumpy didn't even flinch. He didn't need to make a spectacle of it. His reputation had already done that for him. "We'll settle this now, or we'll settle it later," Bumpy said, turning on his heel and walking toward the exit. "But mark my words, Vinnie, you don't get to come into my world and make demands. You're in my game now, and you either learn the rules or you're out." The room remained still for a moment longer before the murmur of voices began to rise, the tension slowly dissipating. No one spoke directly to D'Angelo, no one needed to. The message had been sent loud and clear. The next few days were tense. D'Angelo's pride had been wounded, but his fear was palpable. He was forced to confront the reality that he was no longer the hunter, he was the hunted. The street began to whisper, and those whispers carried the weight of Bumpy Johnson's authority. As for Bumpy, he didn't celebrate his victory. There was no need. The power dynamics had already shifted. Word spread quickly. Vinnie D'Angelo had been put in his place. Harlem wasn't a place for amateurs. It was a place for men who understood respect and power, and if you couldn't give both, you didn't survive. D'Angelo's business didn't last much longer in Harlem. The locals, those who had once entertained his ideas, began to turn their backs. Without the respect of the streets, he was nothing. Bumpy had made sure of that, and in the end, what was left was the legacy of a man who understood that respect wasn't given, it was earned, one action at a time. Would you like me to continue to part 3? Continue. The days after the confrontation with Vinnie D'Angelo were quiet, but that silence was more than just the absence of sound. It was the quiet hum of Harlem settling back into its natural order, an order that had been disturbed by D'Angelo's reckless ambition and now was made whole again by Bumpy Johnson's calculated response. Bumpy didn't need to parade around Harlem boasting of his actions. The truth was far more powerful. By the time D'Angelo's failed venture became common knowledge, Bumpy's name had once again solidified itself as the true authority in Harlem. It wasn't just the violence that spoke to people, it was the way Bumpy had handled the situation. There was no messy spectacle, no public humiliation. There was only respect. His respect for the streets, for the rules that governed them, and for the people who lived by them. Bumpy Johnson was no mere thug or gangster. He was a king in his own right. And in his world, kings didn't need to announce their power. They simply demonstrated it. The ripple effect of the confrontation stretched far beyond just D'Angelo's failure. Word had spread like wildfire through Harlem and the surrounding areas, cementing Bumpy's legacy as someone who didn't simply take what was his, but controlled the very dynamics of the streets. No one would dare challenge him openly again. To do so would be to risk everything, and everyone knew that. Respect in Harlem, as in all the greatest empires, came from understanding who held the power and who deserved it. And Bumpy had reminded everyone who that was. As the years passed, stories of the first big score became legends. The young hustlers, the corner boys, and even the older men who had seen it all would tell the tale of how Bumpy Johnson handled a challenge, how he never raised a fist in anger, but instead used the full weight of his reputation, his word, and his wisdom to make the world bend to his will. Harlem, for all its complexity and danger, had a clear ruler, and his name was Bumpy Johnson. The story of Bumpy Johnson's first big score wasn't just about power, it was about something deeper. It was about the weight of respect, about standing tall in the face of anyone who tried to usurp what you had built. It was a story of justice, not in the legal sense, but in the way justice was meted out in the streets, by men like Bumpy, who understood that respect was the currency that made the world turn. For Bumpy Johnson, that moment didn't just solidify his place at the top, it showed Harlem and the world that respect was not a thing to be taken lightly. It could be given, but more often, it had to be earned. And when someone like Bumpy spoke, people listened. This wasn't just about one man's pride, this was about the pride of a community that had long been told it didn't matter, that it didn't count. But Bumpy Johnson reminded them all that the streets were theirs to command. The message was simple but profound. In Harlem, respect was not negotiable. And as long as his name was spoken in the shadows of the night, there would be no doubt who had earned that respect. In the end, it wasn't just about Bumpy Johnson's victory over a rival. It was about something far more significant. It was a reflection of the world he built. A world where power was earned through action, where respect was the true currency, and where the streets themselves dictated the rules. This moment, the first big score, was more than a pivotal point in Bumpy's career. It was the spark that ignited the myth. It was proof that in a world where every man fought for his place, there was one man who would never be moved, never be swayed. The respect he commanded wasn't born out of fear, but out of the understanding that he stood for something greater. He stood for the dignity of the streets, for the legacy of every man who fought to survive, to thrive, and to leave his mark on the world. For the people of Harlem, the story of Bumpy Johnson's first big score became more than just a story. It became a lesson in what it means to stand firm, to stand tall, and to never let anyone take what's yours. Because in the end, it wasn't about one man's pride, it was about a community's dignity, about the power of knowing your worth and defending it with everything you have. The respect that Bumpy earned that night wasn't just his alone. It was shared by every man who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world of what respect really means. A legend who, even in silence, commands attention. A legend who doesn't just survive in the streets, but becomes the very foundation on which they stand.